Kade sat alone at the edge of the training hall, where the lights were dim, and the voices of other students never reached him, because they never cared to speak to him or look in his direction, and that was how it always had been since the first day at the Galactic Academy, where the best of every planet came to train and compete and prepare for war or exploration or honor. The room was filled with noise and laughter and fake confidence, where everyone tried to stand out and impress the instructors and one another, but Kade never tried, because he knew he could not win that game, and more than that he knew he did not need to. He wore the same gray uniform as the rest of the cadets, but somehow he always looked smaller inside it, like he was trying to disappear, and perhaps he was, because it was easier that way and safer and quieter, and no one questioned the quiet one who never got picked for team drills or sparring matches or simulations. When group missions were assigned, the others would rush to form circles and alliances, and Kade would stand back with his arms folded, waiting until an instructor finally placed him somewhere just to keep the numbers even, and even then the team would barely talk to him, and sometimes even leave him behind on purpose, thinking he was just slowing them down. They called him the ghost or the extra, or sometimes just hey you, and he never corrected them or answered back, because none of it mattered to him, and he was used to being ignored and forgotten, because it had always been that way ever since he left Earth and entered this shiny, clean academy that thought Earth was a broken world full of backward people with no future. But what no one knew was that Earth had made him into something else, and every time he stayed quiet and watched and listened, he was not being weak, but patient and learning and preparing. The announcement came suddenly one bright morning during combat theory class, when the head instructor walked in with a strange look on his face and said in a clear voice that the next Deathworld test would begin in 2 days, and one student from this class would be selected to face it alone. Gasps and nervous laughter filled the room, because the Deathworld test was a legend known for its danger and terror, and the fact that no cadet had ever truly passed it without injury or madness or worse. Deathworlds were planets that rejected life in every way, with storms that tore ships apart, and creatures that hunted in packs, and gravity that crushed bones, and air that burned your lungs, and one cadet would be sent there for 10 days alone with no help, no weapons, and only a drone to monitor survival. The instructor raised his hand and silence fell, and then the name appeared on the screen above the class, and it said Kade of Earth. For a moment no one moved, and then a few students started whispering in disbelief, and then someone laughed and said, "Wait, him really?" And then others joined in, because it felt like a joke or maybe a glitch in the system. Kade just stood there as the room turned to look at him, like he had grown a second head or had been chosen to walk into fire, because that was what Deathworlds were, and they all expected him to break or cry or refuse the mission, but he did none of that. He nodded once and picked up his datapad and walked out of the room without a word, and the silence he left behind was louder than any scream. Darrow, the top student in combat and tactics, scoffed and said, "Well, that's the end of him then," and a few others nodded and smiled nervously, but something about the way Kade walked out made even the instructors glance at each other and say nothing. That night Kade sat in the prep chamber, where the other cadets could not enter, and he watched the terrain maps of the Death World. He would face a place called Vorax 7, where acid rains fell 3 times a day, and the native life was blind but hunted by sound and smell. He memorized the wind patterns, the mineral fields, the nests of large predators, the cycles of light and dark, and he did it all without speaking or asking for help, because everything he needed to know was already in front of him, and he had done harder things before. His memories drifted to his home on Earth, not the shining city seen in galactic news feeds, but the broken lands beyond the shields, where sandstorms lasted weeks, and food had to be hunted and water had to be earned, and every night you listened for movement in the dark and hoped it was not your last night. Earth was a Class Z planet in the official files, listed as unfit for colonization and too unstable for standard life, but Kade was born there and raised there and shaped by it, and to him that world was not death, it was life in its hardest and realest form. The Deathworld test was not a punishment for him, it was familiar, it was almost welcome, because for the first time, he would not have to pretend to be someone else or follow strange academy rules or watch fake heroes show off with tech they barely understood. Now it would be just him and the wild and the truth, and he was ready. The next morning the cadets were called to the hangar to watch Kade board the transport ship, and most of them came for the entertainment, expecting fear or drama or failure. He stepped into the light in a simple suit without armor, and no weapon, only a basic survival pack, and a scanner, and a comm that would not work once he landed, and the drone hovered above his shoulder, like a quiet witness to what was about to come. Some students whispered again, saying, "How long do you think he'll last? And maybe we'll get a new student after this," and Darrow smirked again, and folded his arms. But Instructor Vale, who rarely showed emotion, watched Kade with a strange expression, and said softly under his breath, "That one's different." As the ship doors closed and the engines roared, Kade looked through the window once, and for the first time in years, he felt seen not by the others, but by the world itself, because it was finally calling him to where he truly belonged. He sat back in the seat, closed his eyes, and let the silence return, and in that silence was power, because no one had ever noticed him before. But they would now, and it would begin on the Deathworld. The ship broke through the dark clouds of Vorax 7, and the air shimmered with heat and strange chemicals as the ground below moved like it was alive, shifting and twisting with every gust of wind, and the trees stretched tall like giants, with sharp leaves and breathing bark. The pilot spoke through the comms, saying, "This is as close as I can take you," and the drone beeped twice in confirmation as the doors opened, and heat poured into the cabin with a hiss that made the metal walls groan, and sweat formed instantly on Kade's forehead as he stood and took his first step onto the Deathworld. The air was thick and heavy, filled with strange smells of ash and acid, and something rotten that seemed to cling to his skin like a second layer, and already his suit sensors were warning him of high toxin levels, low oxygen, and unstable ground beneath his boots. But Kade didn't pause, he didn't look back or hesitate. Instead, he scanned the terrain, quickly marking possible shelter, high ground, and water sources, from the small hills to the left, where smoke curled from deep cracks in the earth, like the planet itself was breathing in pain. The drone floated behind him, recording every moment, sending the footage back to the academy, where the other cadets gathered in the viewing room, curious, and maybe hoping he would fail quickly, because that would prove the world still worked the way they understood it. Darrow sat with his arms crossed, a smirk on his face, while others whispered and laughed, saying, "He looks lost already, and let's see how long he lasts," without crying for help. But Instructor Vale watched in silence, eyes sharp and unreadable. Kade moved fast and quiet, every step chosen carefully, every breath controlled, as he wrapped a cloth around his mouth and nose to filter the air, then used a blade from his kit to cut strips from a strange plant that grew in clusters near the rocks, and pressed the sap against the inside of his suit fabric, creating a basic filter system. He had seen these plants before, not here, but on Earth, where similar species grew near sulfur vents, and his hands moved with steady practice, not fear, and the drone clicked softly, as if curious about his method. The sky shifted quickly, clouds rolling like waves, and thunder cracked without warning, sending tremors through the ground, and Kade ducked behind a curved tree with skin like metal, just as the first acid rain began to fall, sizzling against the rocks and burning holes through soft leaves. He pulled a tarp from his pack coated in a neutral gel and held it above himself as the rain passed in a matter of minutes, leaving steam and smoke behind, and the creatures that lived in the cracks began to stir, drawn by sound and heat. From a distance, small figures crawled from under stones, thin and long, with no eyes and dozens of legs that clicked against the ground, and Kade stayed, still, not breathing loud, not moving, until they passed by, unaware of him completely, because he knew that sound meant life or death here, and Earth had taught him to be silent even when terrified. He waited until night began to fall and the sky turned a dull red, and the air cooled slightly, then began to build shelter from large leaves and stone, forming a dome that blended with the terrain, and placed his small energy beacon low to the ground, covered in dust to avoid detection. He used the broken shells of old creatures to line the floor and set up small traps around the area, not to catch food, but to warn him of movement, and his hands never trembled once, because this was not new to him, it was almost familiar. Inside, the academy students watched with wide eyes as the drone footage showed him surviving, not struggling, not screaming, but thinking and adapting faster than any student before, and someone whispered, "He's not supposed to be this good," and another said, "I thought he was just a ghost." Instructor Vale leaned forward, eyes narrowed as he studied the footage, and said softly, "Earth is different from what they think." Back on Vorax 7, the night sounds began, strange and loud calls echoing across the cliffs and valleys as creatures hunted and stalked each other through the shadows, and Kade sat in his shelter listening, counting the seconds between roars and marking the time of each passing threat. He didn't sleep, not that night. Instead, he planned his next moves, mapping out routes using the stars above to track direction, and noting how the moss on the stones turned colors, with temperature a detail he remembered from training long ago under an old Earth hunter who taught him to read the land like a story. As the second day broke with blue light spilling across the twisted trees, Kade set out again, moving along the ridge, where the wind was strongest and the chances of being tracked were lower, and from that height, he saw the ruins far in the distance, old alien structures half buried in sand and bones. He marked their location and changed direction, moving toward a nearby cave he had seen on the scans, where heat signatures were steady and signs of life were small and scattered, not aggressive. Inside the cave, he found old bone-scratched stone walls and a water source deep and still, and when he tested it, the drone beeped and confirmed drinkable with mild treatment, and he smiled faintly, because water meant survival, and survival meant time. Time to learn more, time to explore, time to prepare for what he felt was coming, because he knew this world would not stay silent for long, and there was always something worse waiting beneath the surface. Back at the academy, more students gathered around the viewing screens, watching in silence. Now, as Kade treated the water with charcoal from burned vines, filtered it with cloth, and added minerals from crushed stones, then drank slowly, conserving every drop. No one spoke this time, not even Darrow, who watched with his jaw tight and fists clenched, because the truth was starting to settle in, and it was heavy and undeniable. Kade was winning, not by strength or weapons, but by mind, by skill, by something none of them had seen before, because they never looked beyond the surface, and now they were forced to see him as something more. The instructors began downloading the footage, saving it for future training, and whispers moved through the halls of other academies, where his name was now being spoken for the first time, not in mockery, but in wonder. Back on Vorax 7, Kade crouched near the cave entrance, eyes scanning the horizon, where dark shapes moved in the morning mist, too far to see clearly, but close enough to smell, and he knew something new had entered the area, something bigger and smarter. He didn't run. Instead, he marked their path, watched their movement, then returned to his shelter, and changed his traps, adjusted his escape routes, and started crafting new tools, using bones and shards and acid-proof bark. Because this was not just about surviving anymore. This was about showing the Deathworld that he was not prey. He was ready, and he would not be ignored again. The wind howled across the edge of the canyon, and dust swirled around Kade as he crouched near the rocks, his fingers brushing against old markings, carved deep into the stone, not made by humans, not recent, not welcoming, and he studied them without fear, because he had seen stranger signs in places far more broken than this. The cave behind him was now secure, layered with stone traps and noise alarms made from bone and thread, and the shelter he built there could last for days if needed, but Kade was never one to stay still for long, because stillness invited death, and movement kept the senses sharp like the knives he carried hidden in his sleeves, wrapped in cloth and memory. As he sat there watching the valley below, where small lizard beasts hunted in groups and larger shadows stalked them from higher cliffs, his mind drifted back to the days before the academy, to the dust and silence of Earth, and the sounds that came only at night, when the wind died down and the real threats came out to feed. Earth was not what the galactic files claimed it to be, because the files were old, and the people who wrote them never lived past the outer colonies, and they never saw the real Earth, where storms could rip steel from buildings, and the ground sometimes opened without warning, swallowing towns and roads and lives like a hungry mouth. Kade had grown up far from the shining cities behind the shields, where the elite stayed safe, in high towers, with clean air and quiet rooms, because his family lived where the broken machines still smoked, and the skies burned red for weeks, and the wild ruled every corner that man had once tried to tame. He remembered his father's hands, scarred and rough, from digging shelter out of ruins, and patching together filters from old machines and rusted metal, and his mother's quiet strength as she hunted with makeshift spears, and taught him how to track, how to hide, how to endure, without hope, without safety, without rest. There were no schools, no uniforms, no data pads in his early days, only lessons written in blood and heat and silence, and Kade learned quickly, because slow learners did not last long, and the world did not care for those who could not adapt fast. He remembered the time a quake tore through their village, and he was trapped under rubble for 2 days, breathing through a pipe of cracked plastic and listening to the growls of beasts waiting outside. And when he finally crawled out covered in ash and blood, he did not cry or scream. He simply walked until he found his family and helped rebuild what was left. He remembered the time raiders came wearing old armor and carrying stolen rifles, and his father told him to run to the cliffs and not look back, and he did. And he waited there for a whole day before the sun set, and his mother came for him, alone, her eyes darker than the sky, and her voice even quieter than usual. These memories stayed with him, not like wounds, but like fire kept low under the surface, burning steady and strong, and the Academy never saw this fire, because they never looked deep enough, and maybe they were afraid of what they might find. Back on Vorax 7, Kade moved again, climbing the jagged slope of a narrow ridge, where the stones cut like glass, and the air thinned with every step, and still he climbed higher, drawn by the signal of a long-forgotten structure buried into the cliffs, marked only by a faint hum that pulsed in the dirt like a heartbeat. The drone followed him silently, its lens watching every motion, sending it all back to the Galactic Academy, where more students now gathered around the viewing room, not to laugh or mock, but to study, to understand, and maybe to fear what they were seeing. Darrow sat with a cold expression, arms crossed, but no words now, because even he could no longer deny the truth that Kade was something else, and whatever that something was, it came from a place no training simulation could recreate. Instructor Vale stood by the door, arms behind his back, eyes fixed on the screen, as the image of Kade climbing the ridge filled the wall, and a few instructors whispered to each other, not just about the skill, but about the origin, about Earth, and what else might be hiding there, waiting silent like Kade once was. At the top of the ridge, Kade reached the structure, a half-buried outpost, ancient and rusted, likely built by explorers centuries ago, now dead or forgotten, and he moved through the broken entrance, scanning the walls for power lines, data cores, anything that might still function. Inside, the air was dry and cold, and dust floated like ghosts, and Kade moved carefully, his steps quiet as he searched the rooms, until he found a console still pulsing with faint energy, and he knelt beside it, linking his scanner and bypassing old security without hesitation. The screen flickered and revealed maps of the region, heat zones, nesting areas, energy fields, all forgotten by time, and Kade smiled faintly, because knowledge was power, and here on this world it was the only weapon he needed. He downloaded the data into his pad, then looked around, and found old tools, broken weapons, shattered armor pieces, and even bones of those who came before, and he studied them not with fear, but respect, because he knew the price of survival and the silence of death. As he exited the outpost, the wind picked up and carried with it a new scent, sharp and wet and wrong, and Kade's senses tensed, because something had caught his trail, something that was not hunting food but testing prey, and he moved quickly, covering his tracks and changing direction, looping through narrow canyons and shallow streams to confuse whatever followed. That night, as the stars flickered above the jungle and the cries of the wild echoed far, Kade sat near a fire built with stones and coal wrapped in leaves that blocked the smoke, and he studied the map he had found, marking locations for shelter, for traps, for escape and defense, and every mark was made with care and memory. He thought again of Earth, of the nights spent under broken roofs, listening to creatures crawl over the walls, and the days spent chasing food through crumbling cities, where danger lived in every corner, and no one came to help, because help was just a word, not a promise. And he realized then that the Deathworld was not just a test, not just a mission, it was a mirror, and it showed him not what he feared, but what he was, and what he could become. Back at the Academy, the instructors updated the training files, now labeled Kade of Earth Observation Priority, and the whispers grew louder across the stations and colonies that watched and waited, wondering how this quiet, forgotten cadet had become the center of their attention. The footage from his drone was now being used in classrooms, where cadets were told to study his movement, his choices, his silence, and even Darrow was assigned to analyze Kade's first 2 days on the Deathworld and report on what could be learned from him. The ghost had become the guide. The invisible one had become the standard. And still Kade walked alone through the night, his steps quiet, his eyes steady, his mind always thinking not of winning or glory, but of what came next, because he knew the Deathworld had more to give, and he was ready to take it. The skies above Vorax 7 were never still, and the winds howled like voices from deep caverns, while the ground trembled beneath the weight of storms that came without warning and vanished just as fast, leaving behind scorched trees and broken rocks that steamed with strange heat and glowed under the red sky, as if the world itself had veins of fire, and Kade stood in the middle of it all, calm and unshaken, as if born to this chaos. The drone circled above him, recording every move, every glance, every small act of survival, and across the stars in the Galactic Academy, the viewing room had filled with students, instructors, researchers, and even off-world commanders drawn not by curiosity anymore, but by something heavier, something like fear. Kade had now survived 5 days on the Deathworld, longer than any cadet before, and not just survived, but moved with control and understanding, creating shelter, gathering resources, predicting danger before it struck, and acting with a purpose that none of them expected and none of them could explain. In the back of the room, Darrow sat with his jaw tight, eyes locked on the screen, while others around him whispered in awe and confusion, asking how is he doing this, and who trained him, and where did he learn that kind of thinking, that kind of calm. Instructor Vale stood silently near the entrance, arms crossed and face unreadable, as he listened to the room shift from mockery to disbelief, and from disbelief to respect, and beyond that into something deeper, as if they were all beginning to realize that they had missed something important, not just about Kade, but about everything they thought they understood. The footage showed Kade laying low near a nest of bone serpents, his body covered in mud to hide his heat and scent, while he carefully placed sonic spikes around the area, then moved to higher ground and waited, watching the creatures stir and rise and move into the trap, where a burst of sound sent them fleeing into the open, where 2 were caught in a landslide triggered by Kade's earlier setup. He descended slowly, checked the area, then harvested bone fragments and venom sacs with precise movements, storing them in sealed containers marked with symbols only Earthborns used to code from the forgotten wild zones back home. And when the drone zoomed in, the instructors paused the feed and demanded a translation, but no one could read it. The next segment showed Kade entering a dead zone where gravity shifted and the air shimmered, and most cadets would lose balance or control, but he moved like he had done it before, adjusting his steps, his breathing, his balance, using weighted pouches on his arms and legs to counter the pull, and the students watching started taking notes, copying his every move, as if memorizing a dance they could never perform. Back in the lecture hall of the Academy, copies of the footage were now being used in training simulations, and the file names bore his ID in bold red letters, and cadets whispered his name in the halls, not as a joke now, but like a story passed from one mouth to another, growing in weight and meaning. They called him the Ghost of the Storm, the Earthborn, the Death Whisperer, and the Quiet Fire, and some even started looking up Earth, not the official reports, but the old files, the lost footage, the banned records, and what they found made their hearts beat faster, because Earth was not forgotten, it was ignored on purpose. The reports told of cities swallowed by sand, lightning storms that split mountains, wild zones where nothing survived for long, and creatures born in radiation and rage, and humans who lived among them not in fear, but in fire and dust and blood. And now they knew that Kade was not strange because he was weak, but because he came from something older and harder than any of them had faced. Meanwhile, on Vorax 7, Kade moved deeper into the northern cliffs, where strange signals had been detected by his scanner, signals that pulsed in steady waves like breathing or waiting, and the wind there carried strange sounds, not like animals, but like machines speaking in low voices, and he followed those sounds with steady feet and eyes sharp as blades. He reached a plateau covered in ash and broken metal, and in the center a tower leaned sideways, half buried in stone and time, and Kade entered it, without fear, his scanner clicking softly as the drone followed closely behind. Inside, the air was cold and clean, and the walls pulsed with old energy, and the console at the far end still blinked with life. And Kade approached slowly, scanned the interface, and began to work, fingers moving with skill as he bypassed locks and firewalls left behind by long dead hands. What he found made him stop and stare for the first time since his arrival, because the data showed this place was not just an outpost, but a testing ground used by an ancient race to measure potential and record evolution. And the Deathworld was not just wild, it was built, designed, shaped by unknown minds for unknown reasons. He downloaded the data and turned away, already calculating what this meant, because this changed everything, not just for him, but for the Academy, and maybe for the galaxy itself. And the drone beeped twice, as if sensing the shift in weight. Far away, the Academy received the new footage, and the instructors gathered in the main council room to view it together silent, as the screen showed the strange alien text. The ancient map of energy flows across the planet, and the footage of Kade walking away from the tower with that same calm silence that now haunted their thoughts. Commander Selen, a veteran of 5 wars, leaned forward and said in a low voice, "He is not just surviving, he is learning, he is listening, and he is seeing what we could not see." And Instructor Vale nodded slowly, replying, "We judged him by what he lacked, not by what he carried." Back in the cadet barracks, Darrow threw a training pad against the wall and shouted enough, and stormed out while others sat still watching the screen as Kade set up camp near a ridge and began crafting tools from alien metal, shaping edges with acid and binding handles with plant fiber. And some whispered that he was not a student anymore, he was something else, something becoming. The Quiet One was now a storm of fire, a name etched in whispers and wonder, and even those who never spoke to him before now sat in silence, thinking of the days they laughed at him or turned away or forgot he existed, and feeling something close to shame. On Vorax 7 the night came again, loud and alive, and Kade stood beneath the stars looking up as if seeing something far away, something coming, and the wind moved around him. But he did not move. He just stood there, a shadow of Earth, a memory of silence and strength, and the death world watched him back, waiting. Because now they all noticed, and nothing would ever be the same. The sun over Vorax 7 never looked the same from one day to the next, and on the 6th morning it rose behind thick black clouds that moved like slow waves, and the air buzzed with quiet energy that seemed to cling to Kade's skin as he stepped out from his shelter and felt the ground hum beneath his boots, like something deep below had awakened and was rising. He crouched low and pressed his hand against the dirt, feeling the small vibrations that moved in sharp patterns, not from storms or creatures or weather, but from something bigger, something thinking and something searching. And he knew then that the time of observing and learning was over, and the next part of the test had begun. The drone above beeped once, a sharp sound like warning, and he glanced at it, then toward the ridge where his traps had been laid the night before, now torn apart like paper, with the remains scattered far beyond the blast zone, and no blood, no bones, no trace of what destroyed them except for deep claw marks on stone and scorched earth that hissed with heat. Kade did not run. He moved instead with slow, careful steps, circling wide and low across the valley, watching for signs of passage. Broken branches moved, stones, heat trails, and disturbed dust, and what he found chilled him, because the path was wide and clear and deliberate, as if the thing that moved there wanted him to see its steps. Back at the academy, the viewing room was packed tighter than ever, and the silence was complete, as the footage showed Kade tracking the unknown force through the cliffs and across the broken plains, where strange shadows moved in the fog, and every few minutes a deep low growl could be heard like thunder beneath the world. Darrow stood in the corner, eyes dark with something between fear and frustration, while others leaned forward, unable to blink, afraid they might miss the moment when the test turned into something else entirely. And Instructor Vale watched with a still face, but his hands gripped the data pad tighter than before. The death world was alive, not just with nature but with intelligence, and it had sent something after Kade, something old and made not born, and the instructors began pulling old records, forgotten logs buried deep in black archives, and what they found made even the bravest among them grow quiet. The Guardian was what the files called it, a creature of metal and flesh built by the planet's former masters to hunt intruders and test survivors, a being that did not stop, did not sleep, and did not retreat once it had marked a target, and now it was moving toward Kade with purpose and speed. Meanwhile, Kade reached the edge of a narrow ravine where the air grew cold and sharp, and he descended into it using ropes made from twisted vines and reinforced cable, his eyes scanning the cracks in the stone for signs of ambush, and every shadow seemed to move in the corner of his vision, but he kept his pace steady and his breath low. He found a cave near the bottom, hidden behind a wall of vines, and slipped inside, where the air changed again, becoming dry and still, and the noise of the world vanished as if the cave had swallowed it. And in the darkness, he lit a flame with a survival torch and saw the markings carved into the walls, symbols like those in the tower, but older, deeper, more desperate. They told stories of trials of blood, of warriors who came before and failed, and he understood then that he was not the first to walk this path, but perhaps he was the first to truly listen to what the death world was saying through storm and fire and shadow. He spent the next hours building new traps, stronger, faster, smarter, using the metal from the tower, the venom from the serpents, and the heat cells from his pack to create explosions strong enough to wound even machines, and he shaped new weapons, knives with bone cores and acid edges balanced for throwing and silent kills. The drone hovered nearby, recording everything, but this time its lens blinked red, as if sensing what was coming, and in the data feed sent to the Academy the warnings had changed, now marked as extreme threat, unknown class, apex predator approaching target range. The instructors began debating calling the test off, sending emergency extraction, but the commander shook his head and said we wanted to see what Earth could do, and now we must watch it through to the end. Kade finished his preparations and moved to higher ground, a ledge above the cave with cover and line of sight, and there he waited, body still, breath low, heart steady, and around him the world seemed to hold its own breath as the wind dropped and the birds vanished and even the insects went silent. Then it came. A shadow, first tall and wrong with too many limbs, and a head like a broken crown, eyes that glowed blue, and steam rising from its joints with each step, and the ground shook beneath its weight as it moved directly toward the cave, sniffing the air with something like memory, something that recognized the scent of challenge. Kade watched, measured, and chose his moment, then threw the first knife into the beast's shoulder, where the joints met, and the metal sparked, and the creature turned faster than anything that size should move, and roared not in pain, but in acknowledgement, as if greeting a worthy rival. Then the traps sprang one by one, explosions, fire spikes, gas clouds, each striking from a different angle, and the Guardian staggered, but did not fall, and leapt toward the ledge with terrifying speed, forcing Kade to dive, and rolled down the slope, landing hard, but on his feet with knife drawn and eyes burning. The fight was not elegant, it was raw, brutal, wild, with Kade moving through narrow gaps, leaping over rocks, ducking under claws, and striking with precision, while the Guardian followed, crushing trees and tearing stone, its roar shaking the air, and its claws slicing through the mist like lightning. Back at the Academy the footage played live, and no one spoke, not even Darrow, who stood frozen, as Kade used every trick, every skill, every lesson from Earth to stay alive, and every time the Guardian seemed to corner him, he found a new path, a new trick, a new answer. The instructors began to understand that this was more than survival, this was transformation, and the boy they ignored was now a force shaped by a world they had never respected. The battle raged into the twilight as the red sun dipped low and shadows stretched long, and finally, with one last trap, a charge buried under the ground triggered by the weight of the Guardians, stepped the final explosion, sent the creature falling into a deep ravine, its body burning and broken and gone. Kade stood at the edge, covered in ash, blood, and dust, breathing heavy, but standing tall, and the drone hovered beside him, recording the silence that followed as the Deathworld fell quiet again, as if satisfied. And across the stars the Academy watched, not in judgment or pity, but in awe, because they had seen something rare, something real, something human, in its rawest form, and they knew they would never forget it. Because now the hunter had been hunted, and Earth had won. The wind returned after the battle, stronger, colder, sharper, as if the Deathworld itself had paused for a moment to watch, then decided to breathe again, and Kade stood at the edge of the broken ravine, staring down at the twisted, burning remains of the Guardian, knowing deep in his chest that this fight had changed more than his score or his rank. It had shifted something greater, something old. Smoke curled upward into the sky, and the ground around him was blackened with fire and blood and strange oils, and the air was heavy with silence, not the quiet of peace, but the kind that comes after a storm when nothing dares to move, and even the wild things stay hidden in their holes, waiting to see what new rule has taken shape. Kade's body was bruised and cut, his suit torn in 3 places, and one shoulder swollen and burning with pain from where the Guardian had thrown him against the rocks, and yet he stood straight, eyes watching every shadow, every sound, ready for more, because Earth had never taught him to rest after a fight, only to prepare for the next one. He reached into his pack, pulled out a small case, and injected a dark green liquid into his side, gritting his teeth as the pain eased, and his vision cleared just enough to keep him steady and alive, because the mission was not over, and he still had a message to send. The drone hovered beside him, lens flickering with static and damage from the final explosion, and Kade reached up to adjust the settings, switching the camera to manual feed, then began to speak, his voice low, and even, not for the Academy, not for the cadets, not for the instructors, but for anyone listening who had ever been ignored or forgotten or laughed at. He said this world is not chaos, it is structure, it is memory, it is a test, and if you do not respect it, it will break you. But if you listen and learn and adapt, it will show you who you really are. And I am not here to impress anyone, I am here to survive and to understand and to prove that Earth was never weak. It was forged to create people who can face anything and still stand. The transmission went live across the network and reached every room, every station, every fleet connected to the Academy, and the silence that followed was thicker than before, filled with something new, something close to reverence. Back at the Academy, the instructors replayed the message 3 times in a row while the students sat in stunned quiet, and Darrow, who once mocked Kade, stared at the screen without blinking, his hands clenched at his sides as the truth settled in heavy and undeniable. Instructor Vale stood slowly, walked to the center console, and activated the emergency council alert, bringing in high command members across 3 systems, and when asked why, he answered with one word: Earth. Meanwhile, Kade climbed down the ravine toward the broken frame of the Guardian, not out of curiosity, but out of duty, because he needed to know what it was made of, what powered it, and why it had moved like it had a mind. And when he reached the wreckage, he saw pieces of technology that no Academy file had ever shown, tools of design, not nature, and marks that looked more like code than art. He took samples, careful, precise, and stored them in sealed containers, then marked the location on his pad, and began the long walk back toward his shelter, limping slightly, but never slowing his pace even as the wind pushed against him and the cold cut through the open gaps in his suit. By the time he returned, night had fallen, and the stars above shimmered in strange colors, and he could hear the forest breathing again, full of motion, but nothing approached him, not now, not after what he had done. And in that moment he realized he had become something more than a student, more than a test subject. He had become part of the Deathworld story. He spent the night repairing his shelter, reinforcing it, and tending to his wounds, and when sleep finally came, it was deep and dreamless, and the fire inside his mind burned steady, not with rage or pain, but with purpose. The next morning he prepared his final beacon, a flare designed to mark mission end and request retrieval, and when he activated it, the sky above lit with a green light that pierced the clouds and shimmered across the valley, calling the transport ship waiting in orbit to come and collect him. The ship arrived within hours, landing in the same clearing where he first touched down, and this time the door opened slowly with a hiss and a silence that felt almost respectful, and as he stepped aboard, he glanced back once at the world that had tested him, shaped him, and in some way accepted him. The drone followed him inside, powered down, and docked into the recording bay, and as the door sealed, the engines lifted him away from the world below and toward the place that once ignored him, now waiting with wide eyes and open files and more questions than answers. The flight back was quiet and long, and Kade sat alone in the cabin, replaying the footage, analyzing every move, every sound, every mistake, and every success, because Earth had taught him that survival was not the end, it was the beginning of understanding. When the ship docked at the Academy landing bay, the hangar was full with instructors, cadets, officers, and silent rows of people who once looked past him, now standing in formation, eyes locked on the doors, waiting to see the one who returned from a death world that had taken so many before him. As the doors opened and the ramp lowered, Kade stepped out with slow, even steps, head held high, eyes scanning the crowd, and no one spoke, no one moved for a moment, as if afraid to break the moment. Then Instructor Vale stepped forward and gave a nod, a gesture not of command but of respect, and said, "Welcome back, cadet." And Kade nodded once in return, saying, "I am ready for the next step." Behind him the drone activated and projected the final message. He had recorded the one meant for Earthborn cadets everywhere, the one that said, "They may ignore you, they may laugh, they may push you aside, but one day you will stand where no one else can, and the world will listen." And that message echoed through the halls of the Academy, across systems and colonies, and back to Earth itself, where those who lived beyond the shields saw the face of someone who spoke their truth with fire, not words. The boy they ignored was now a name carved into the history of the Death World, and his story had only just begun. The hall was colder than the landing bay, wide and polished and echoing with footsteps that never rushed, and Kade walked through it alone, but this time the silence felt different, not empty, not lonely, more like space being made for something new, something that had not existed here before and now demanded room. He passed under the banners of the great systems and the statues of long-dead heroes, carved from alien stone, each one placed to remind cadets of who they were supposed to become, but none of them looked like him, none of them walked like him, none of them came from the same dust and fire and broken sky that raised him and shaped him. The central chamber doors opened without a word, and the council stood waiting. 9 instructors, one from each region, all with faces trained to hide reaction, yet their eyes flickered when they saw him, not in fear or judgment, but in realization, like they finally understood what had been hidden in plain sight all along. Kade stopped at the center of the circle where the light above dimmed to a glow, and the drone behind him hovered silently and projected the data from Vorex 7, in full, the traps, the movements, the guardian, the outpost, the codes, and at the end his final message recorded with steady breath and eyes that had seen beyond the surface of everything. No one interrupted. When the projection ended, Instructor Vale stepped forward, his voice steady, yet lower than usual, and he asked, "Do you know what this means?" And Kade answered without hesitation, "I know what it meant to survive there, and I know what it means now to come back and still be unchanged." Another council member asked, "What do you want?" And Kade paused for the first time, not because he did not know, but because he wanted the weight of the moment to land on every ear, every heart, every unspoken doubt in the room. He said, "I want the truth about Earth unsealed. I want the records corrected. I want every cadet from my world given the same tools and training you give to the others. And I want silence no longer used as armor against those who come from less light and more fire." A long pause followed, then murmurs, then another question. Why should we trust someone who hid their strength, who waited to show what they could really do? Kade looked around the circle and said, "I did not hide it, I lived it, I carried it while you looked away. And now you have seen it, and you cannot forget." Silence again. But this time it was not resistance, it was agreement in the shape of stillness. And from behind the council commander Selen entered a tall figure wrapped in dark silver, with medals that weighed more than most cadets ever lifted, and his voice cut through the air like wind before a storm. He said, "The quiet ones are often the ones worth hearing, and Earth is not a mistake, it is a crucible, and what comes from it deserves a place here, not at the edge, but at the center." With emotion, the council accepted his words, not just for Kade, but for all Earthborns, and in that moment a ripple moved across the academy, a change slow, but deep and irreversible. In the days that followed, new policies were written, new maps drawn, and the Earth sector was elevated from restricted to recognized, and its training centers reconnected to the galactic grid, and the cadets there received full access to tools, mentors, and missions. They sent messages back, each one filled with hope and disbelief, and quiet pride messages that said, "We saw him, and now we believe in what we can become." Kade received them in private, never replying with long words, only with updates and coordinates, and advice sent in code, the same Earthborn marks he carved into cave walls on Vorex 7, now used as a quiet language between those who understood survival by heart. He remained at the academy for another cycle, not as a student, not as a commander, but as something between a guide and a symbol, and cadets came to him, not for stories, but for clarity, and those who once ignored him now waited for his smallest insights, as if they were flame in the dark. Darrow approached him one day by the training fields where the wind smelled like metal and sweat, and he did not speak for a while, just stood there until he said, "I was wrong," and Kade nodded, because there was nothing else needed between warriors who had once faced themselves. In time, a new test was written based on Kade's journey, a program called Earthborn Protocol, designed not to measure strength, but adaptation, resilience, instinct, and quiet fire, and it became the hardest course in the academy, one that only few attempted and even fewer completed. Kade watched the first class take it silently from the shadows, eyes sharp, arms folded, and in their struggle he saw echoes of his own path, and though he never stepped in to help, he was always there when they emerged, broken, tired, shaking, but alive. He left the academy without ceremony, taking only what he needed and vanishing into the outer systems, where conflict brewed, and ancient signals called to those who listened, and the last image they had of him was not on a podium or a parade, but on a ship alone, watching the stars shift as he plotted a course into the unknown. Reports came in later of a lone fighter taking down pirate fleets, protecting mining colonies, solving old codes in dead alien temples, and each time the descriptions were vague, but the name was always whispered: the Earthborn, the silent flame, the one who passed the Deathworld. And across every system where Earth was once a forgotten line on a map, now it stood marked with a symbol, not of fire or war, but of survival, and every young cadet, who felt too small, too broken, too lost to matter, now had a name to follow and a story to believe in. Kade never returned to the academy, not because he was not welcome, but because his place was never in polished halls or under bright lights. It was in the wild and the broken, in the edge between chaos and truth, where real strength is born. And though many searched for him, none ever found him, not truly, because by the time they arrived all that remained was a mark carved into stone, the old Earthborn code, and the wind carrying dust through the trees, as if whispering, he was here, he saw, he changed everything.